The land stretched wide and open under the early morning sun, a place where the dew clung to tall blades of grass and horses breathed steam into the cool air. For generations, this land had been a sanctuary, a symbol of freedom and dignity, a reminder that despite history's scars, a man could still carve out his own space in America. It wasn't just property, it was identity, it was peace, it was home. And for Marcus Carter, a proud black rancher in his early 40s, it was the dream he had worked toward all his life. Marcus was not born into wealth. He had no inheritance, no shortcuts. He was the son of a janitor and a school cafeteria worker, people who knew struggle like the back of their hands. They had taught him that dignity wasn't given. It was fought for, held on to, defended, against the world that often wanted to strip it away. Every extra shift, every missed holiday, every backbreaking day of labor had gone into buying this ranch on the outskirts of a small town that prided itself on community. To Marcus, that word once carried hope, but soon it would reveal itself as something else. It began with whispers. At first, neighbors glanced at him with suspicion, the kind of subtle hostility that didn't always need words. He noticed how conversations would pause when he walked into the local feed store, how smiles quickly faded into tightened lips. Some waved politely, others looked away. But Marcus was not naive. He had seen this before. He had lived it. He told himself it didn't matter. He had not bought the ranch to be liked. He had bought it to live free. The ranch had been his sanctuary for 5 years before the first real confrontation came. A neatly typed letter arrived in his mailbox from the local homeowners association, the HOA that governed properties in his area. The letter was full of rules, clauses, and passive-aggressive reminders. They said his fencing didn't align with community standards. They said his livestock exceeded acceptable limits. They said his barn was painted out of code. Marcus chuckled bitterly as he read the words. He knew what they meant, but wouldn't say out loud. He didn't belong. Still, Marcus was a man of patience. He tried to comply where he could, made adjustments, even attended an HOA meeting. But the meeting was worse than the letter. The room was filled with polite hostility, the kind where smiles were thin and every sentence dripped with judgment. One man, leaning back in his chair, muttered under his breath, "Not sure why folks like him think they can run a place like this." Marcus heard it. Everyone heard it, but no one said a word. That was the first cut. But the deepest wound came later. One morning, Marcus awoke to the sound of machinery. He stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, and froze. There, at the edge of his property, a construction crew, hired by the HOA, was installing a tall, cold fence. It wrapped like a cage, cutting across the wide-open beauty of his land. By noon, it stood as an ugly scar across the landscape, an iron wall separating him from the rest of the community. But worse than that, there was no gate on his side. The HOA had fenced him in. The message was loud and clear. They wanted him boxed in, trapped, humiliated. They wanted to remind him that this was their community, not his. Marcus stood there in silence for a long time. His horses paced uneasily inside the enclosure, sensing his frustration. His chest rose and fell with slow breaths, his jaw tight. He felt the anger burn in his veins, but he did not yell, did not beg, did not let them see him break. Instead, he whispered to himself words his father once said, "They can build walls, son, but they can't fence in your will." For days, Marcus tried to fight it through proper channels. He sent letters, made phone calls, even contacted lawyers. But everywhere he turned, the HOA hid behind its rules and regulations. Some laughed at his complaints, others ignored him entirely. The humiliation grew heavier with each passing day. He could not freely move his livestock. He could not bring his truck through the way he used to. He had to circle miles around just to get in and out. Every time he saw that fence, he felt the sting of their cruelty. But Marcus was not the kind of man to surrender. His dignity was older than their rules, stronger than their fences. And when people pushed him into a corner, he did not shrink. He planned. The turning point came one evening as he sat on his porch, watching the sun sink behind the horizon. He thought about his parents, about how they had taught him never to bow his head to injustice. He thought about his ancestors, about chains far heavier than the metal fence surrounding his land. And then, with a slow grin spreading across his face, Marcus realized something. The HOA might have built the fence, but they had made one mistake. They had only one gate, and that gate led through a piece of property just outside his fence line. Property that, to his knowledge, was up for sale. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaled deeply, and whispered to himself, "If they hold the key, then I'll own the lock." What followed was a plan bold enough to shake the very foundation of that HOA. While they laughed, while they mocked, while they believed they had caged him, Marcus was working behind the scenes, negotiating quietly, discreetly, patiently. The property with the gate key was expensive, but Marcus had been saving, investing wisely, and preparing for moments just like this. He scraped together resources, sold a few head of cattle, and called in favors. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, he moved closer to his goal. Weeks later, the deal closed. The land was his, and with it, the only gate that gave access in and out of the fenced enclosure. The day he walked up to that gate, the key heavy in his palm, Marcus felt something rise in his chest that he had not felt since buying the ranch. Freedom. He slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and the gate swung open with a metallic groan. His horses neighed, his truck rumbled, and Marcus, head high, shoulders strong, drove through that gate with pride that no HOA could steal. But he wasn't done, because what Marcus had done was more than win access to his land. He had outplayed them on their own chessboard. The HOA, with all its power and arrogance, had overlooked the fact that control works both ways, and now, with the gate in his possession, Marcus controlled them. Every car, every truck, every delivery that needed that access now had to pass through the land he owned. The same neighbors who once mocked him now had to see him every time they came and went. The same board that had laughed at his complaints now had to recognize his authority. The balance of power had shifted, and the irony was almost poetic. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in their faces. That wasn't his style. Instead, he carried himself with quiet dignity, the same way he always had. But the smile on his face, when he leaned against that gate watching traffic pass, was a message stronger than any words. You tried to cage me, but I became the gatekeeper, and though the battle wasn't over, though the HOA would push back, scheme, and fight to reclaim control, Marcus had already proven a truth older than fences and deeper than prejudice. You cannot trap a man who refuses to surrender his dignity. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. At first it was whispers, the kind that slip between lips at the grocery store and echo in hushed conversations at HOA meetings. "Did you hear?" someone asked, voice trembling with disbelief. Marcus Carter bought the gate property. Some refused to believe it, others laughed it off. But when they saw Marcus standing tall by that gate with the key clipped to his belt, the truth settled in. The HOA had built a fence to trap him. And now, the man they tried to cage was the only one holding the door. The next HOA meeting was unlike any other. The community center was filled with tense energy, chairs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor as homeowners settled in. At the front sat the HOA board, 5 people who had long believed they controlled every inch of this community. Their president, Harold Whitaker, an aging man with sharp glasses and sharper words, cleared his throat as though preparing for a battle. "We have a serious issue," Harold began, his voice clipped. "This development with Mr. Carter and the gate is not only irregular, it's unacceptable. This community cannot function with one individual holding control over access." From the back, a voice called out, dripping with venom, "That's what happens when you let outsiders in." The room fell quiet. All eyes darted toward Marcus. He sat alone near the back, his wide-brimmed hat tilted low, arms crossed, face calm. He did not flinch. He did not rise to the bait. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly, a small act of defiance that spoke louder than any argument. Mr. Carter, Harold said, adjusting his glasses, I think it's best we discuss terms. Surely you understand the inconvenience this causes. Marcus finally stood, his boots echoing against the floor as he walked to the center of the room. He looked at the board, then at the faces in the crowd, neighbors who had laughed, whispered, and tried to make him invisible. His voice, when it came, was steady and firm. You all built a fence around me, he said. You boxed me in like I didn't belong. You didn't ask. You didn't care. Now you come here talking about inconvenience. No, what you're feeling. Now, and that's what you wanted me to feel. Only difference is, I don't break easy. The room stirred with murmurs. Some shifted uncomfortably, others glared. Harold's lips tightened. This isn't personal, Mr. Carter. These are community rules. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Rules are supposed to be fair, but you didn't build that fence for community. You built it for me. Don't dress it up. As anything else, the silence that followed was heavy. No one spoke, but the truth hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Marcus gave a single nod and walked back to his seat. He didn't need to say more. His presence was enough. But if Marcus thought that moment would end their fight, he was mistaken. The HOA regrouped quickly. They sent more letters, this time accusing him of obstructing traffic, of holding the community hostage. They threatened fines, legal action, even removal of his rights as a landowner. Some neighbors stopped speaking to him altogether. Others grew bolder in their hostility. One morning, Marcus found graffiti sprayed across his barn door. Go back. The words were crude, ugly, and yet familiar, a reminder of a hatred that had never truly gone away. For a moment, Marcus stood staring at the paint, his fists clenched, his chest tight. He thought of his father again, of the battles fought before him, and then, slowly, he reached for a bucket of paint. With measured strokes, he painted over the words, covering the hate with dignity. By the time he finished, the barn gleamed brighter than before. That night, as the sun dipped below the hills, Marcus sat on his porch with his closest friend, Elijah, a fellow rancher who had stood by him since the beginning. Elijah was older, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelty. They won't stop, Elijah warned, sipping from his mug. Men like that, they see you standing tall, it bothers them. They'll push harder. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant fence line. Let 'em push. I've stood against worse. Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. Yeah, but this ain't just about fences anymore. This is about pride. Their pride versus yours. And pride, Marcus, it can drive men to do foolish, dangerous things. The words lingered. Marcus knew Elijah was right. Already, the tension in the community felt like dry kindling waiting for a spark. The next confrontation came on a rainy afternoon. Marcus was repairing a section of his barn roof when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV rolled up to the gate and out stepped Harold Whitaker, flanked by two HOA board members. They walked with forced confidence, umbrellas shielding them from the rain. Mr. Carter, Harold called out, his voice raised over the patter of rain. We need access through the gate. A delivery truck is on its way. Marcus climbed down from the roof, his movements unhurried. He wiped his hands on his jeans and approached the gate. Truck can wait, he said. Harold's face tightened. You don't understand. The supplies are for community maintenance. You can't just delay access. Marcus leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. Funny, that's what you did to me. Built a whole fence without asking. Didn't think delay mattered then. One of the board members, a woman named Cynthia, stepped forward. Her tone was sharp. Mr. Carter, this isn't a game. If you think owning this small strip of land gives you power over this community, you're mistaken. We will find a way around. You, Marcus's eyes locked on hers, you already found your way around me when you put me in this box. Now you're just learning what it feels like on the other side. The delivery truck arrived minutes later, headlights cutting through the rain. It stopped at the gate, waiting. Harold looked at Marcus, his jaw tight. You gonna open it or not? Marcus pulled the key from his pocket, weighed it in his hand, then slowly inserted it into the lock. The gate creaked open, wide enough for the truck to pass. Harold and the others walked through without a word, their silence heavy with frustration. But Marcus wasn't blind. He saw the look in their eyes. They weren't just angry, they were plotting. That night, as thunder rolled across the hills, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He checked his locks twice, walked the perimeter of his land and stood for a long time by the gate. The rain soaked his hat, his jacket, but he didn't move. He had fought too hard for this land to be run off by fear. Still, the unease lingered. In the days that followed, Marcus noticed strange things. His mailbox was knocked down twice. His cattle feed went missing. One morning, he found one of his fences cut clean through. These weren't accidents. They were warnings. The HOA was done with letters and fines. Now, they were testing his patience, his will. But Marcus was no stranger to intimidation. He had been tested before, on the streets of his childhood, in the classrooms where teachers doubted him, in the jobs where supervisors overlooked him. Every time he had risen, this time would be no different. He replaced the fence. He rebuilt the mailbox. He bought locks stronger than before, and every time they tried to break him, Marcus grew more determined. Then came the day that would shift everything again. It was a Saturday morning when Marcus heard the sound of shouting outside his ranch. He rushed to the gate and saw a group of neighbors gathered, led by Harold. They held signs, crude messages scrawled across them. "No gate, tyrant! One man can't control us all. HOA first." It was a protest directed at him. Marcus stood silently at the gate as they chanted. His horses shifted nervously in the distance, spooked by the noise. The protesters' voices rose, fueled by anger, by prejudice, by the fear of losing control. Cameras flashed as someone recorded the scene, hoping to humiliate him further. But Marcus did not waver. He stood tall, his presence unshaken. And, when the noise reached its peak, he raised his voice above the crowd. "You all think this is about a gate," he said, his voice carrying over the shouts. "But it's not. This is about respect. You built a fence to shut me out. You wanted to remind me I didn't belong. But I do. This is my land, my home, my right, and no matter how loud you yell that you can't fence that in." For a moment the crowd faltered. Some lowered their signs. Others muttered angrily. Harold glared, his face red with frustration. But Marcus turned and walked back toward his porch, leaving them shouting at his back. The protest fizzled by afternoon, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The HOA wouldn't stop. They would push harder, dig deeper, and strike where it hurt most. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, Marcus felt the weight of the coming storm. He knew the next move would not be theirs alone. He would have to fight, not just for himself, but for the dignity of every man who had ever been boxed in, fenced off, or told he didn't belong. And deep inside, he was ready, because Marcus Carter was no longer just a rancher. He was the gatekeeper, and this fight had only just begun. The protest outside Marcus's ranch had rattled the quiet hills. For days afterward, he noticed strangers slowing their cars as they passed, gawking at his property as though it were some kind of spectacle. Word of the confrontation had spread. Far beyond the neighborhood, someone's video of Marcus standing calmly at the gate while protesters shouted at him had gone viral on social media. The clip was titled, "HOA versus Rancher, Man Owns Only Gate in Town." Within hours, the internet exploded. Comments flooded in. Some praised Marcus, calling him a hero for standing up against a system that tried to box him in. Others spewed venom, branding him selfish, arrogant, or worse. The internet had turned his private struggle into a public debate, and Marcus, who had wanted nothing more than peace and quiet on his land, was now thrust into the unforgiving glare of the spotlight. The HOA board, humiliated by the unwanted attention, wasted no time in striking back. Within a week, Marcus received a thick envelope stamped with legal insignia. It was a lawsuit filed by the HOA, accusing him of obstructing access, violating community trust, and intentionally harming the neighborhood's function. The language was sharp, intimidating, written to bury him under technicalities. They wanted the gate under their control, and they were willing to drag Marcus through the courts to get it. At his kitchen table, Marcus sat staring at the stack of papers. His hands rested heavy on the wood. His mind buzzed. Lawyers cost money, and while Marcus was proud of what he'd built, he wasn't a wealthy man. The HOA, on the other hand, had deep pockets and endless resources. They could bleed him dry with motions, delays, and endless filings. Across from him, Elijah slammed his fist down. "This is what they do, Marcus. They can't break you with fences, so they try with paper. But listen, you can't give in. Not now. Not when the whole world's watching. Marcus rubbed his temples. I didn't ask for the world to watch, Elijah. I just wanted my land, my peace. Elijah leaned closer, voice low and steady. Sometimes we don't get to choose when the fight finds us. But when it does, you either stand or you fall. And I've never known you to fall. Those words sparked something deep inside Marcus. Memories. His father, who worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. His mother, who walked miles to scrub floors, telling him, no one can take your worth. And the ancestors before them, who had endured chains, laws, whips, humiliation, and still rose. This fight was bigger than a gate. This was about dignity. Marcus hired a lawyer. Her name was Dana Williams. Young, sharp, ambitious. She came recommended by a civil rights group that had caught wind of his story. Dana had a reputation for standing toe-to-toe with powerful institutions. At their first meeting, Dana flipped through the HOA's lawsuit with calm precision. They think they can intimidate you, she said, almost amused. But they've overreached. This isn't just about property. It's about discrimination, targeting, abuse of authority. And if they want a fight, she closed the folder and looked Marcus in the eye. I'll give them one. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. The first court hearing was tense. The HOA's lawyers entered in expensive suits, polished shoes echoing against the floor. They spoke with rehearsed arrogance, painting Marcus as a selfish man holding an entire community hostage. They called him reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous. But when Dana rose to speak, her words cut through like a blade. She told the story of the fence, of Marcus boxed in by humiliation. She spoke of fairness, dignity, and the basic right of every man to live without harassment. And then she said the words that made the entire courtroom still. This case is not about a gate. It is about whether power gives anyone the right to strip dignity from a man simply because of who he is. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. The HOA's lawyers shifted in their seats, and Marcus felt pride swelling in his chest. Outside the courtroom, the war raged on. The HOA doubled down, rallying neighbors with flyers slipped under doors. Take back control of our community. Online forums buzzed with hostility. Some neighbors turned cold, avoiding Marcus. Others openly glared, and then came the intimidation. One night, tire tracks slashed across his pasture, flattening his crops. Another night, a brick crashed through his living room window, scattering glass across the floor. Each act sent a message. You don't belong here. But Marcus refused to break. He fixed what was damaged. He replaced what was broken. And each morning, he walked the length of his land, boots pressing into soil that was his by right, reminding himself, they can't take this from me. The media swarmed. Journalists camped outside the gates. Civil rights activists showed up at hearings, their signs reading not just about Marcus, but about justice. One day, as Marcus left the courthouse, a boy no older than 12 approached him timidly. "Mister," the boy whispered, "my dad says you're fighting for us too. He says you're showing them we don't have to be scared no more." Marcus knelt, emotion tightening his throat. "Tell your dad he's right, and tell him this: never let anyone fence you in." The boy nodded fiercely before running off. That moment stayed with Marcus longer than the threats, because now he realized this wasn't just his fight anymore, it was bigger. The climax came during a heated session in court. The HOA's lawyers demanded Marcus surrender the gate property to restore peace and order to the neighborhood. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, activists, reporters, all waiting. Marcus stood, asked permission to speak. The judge nodded, and Marcus, with steady voice, addressed them all. "You want me to give up my land. You want me to hand over the key. But let me tell you this. I worked my whole life for this ranch. Every drop of sweat, every sacrifice was for this. And you think I'll give it up because it makes you uncomfortable? No, I won't. You can write your papers, file your lawsuits, throw your stones, but I will not hand you the dignity you tried to steal from me. You don't get to decide when a man belongs. I do." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed with respect. Across the room, Harold Whitaker slammed his palm down. "This is absurd. He's making a mockery of this community." But Harold's voice, once commanding, now sounded desperate. As the session ended, Marcus walked out of the courthouse with his head held high. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, activists cheered, and Marcus knew the tide was beginning to turn. But he also knew this. The HOA wasn't finished. They would strike harder, more ruthless than before, and as Marcus glanced back at the courthouse, catching Harold's glare burning into him like fire, he whispered under his breath, "You tried to fence me in, but now I'm the wall you can't climb." The storm was far from over. The weeks after the last court hearing carried a heavy silence across Marcus's land. The HOA board, humiliated in front of the town and furious at the judge's refusal, nursed their pride like a wound that would not heal. But humiliation turned quickly into vengeance, and Harold Whitaker, his face set with rage, was determined to reclaim what he had lost. The attacks came quietly at first. One morning, Marcus awoke to find his cattle scattered across the fields, fence wires cut clean through in the night. Another evening, smoke rose near his barn, a fire set deliberately, only to be smothered before it could devour his livelihood. Each act carried the same message: if we cannot defeat you in court, we will break you on your land. Marcus reported it all, but the sheriff's deputies, men who shook hands with Harold over weekend golf games, only offered dismissive shrugs. "Could have been kids," one said flatly. But Marcus knew better. These were not accidents, they were warnings, and still he refused to bend. He rebuilt the fences, hammered the barn back into shape, and walked his land each night with the same steady dignity that had carried him this far. Yet inside, the weight pressed harder. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside his window set his heart racing. For the first time, fear tried to sink its roots into his spirit. One evening, Elijah's old pickup rumbled down the dirt road. He found Marcus on the porch, a shotgun across his lap, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "You can't live like this forever, brother," Elijah said, easing himself down beside him. "I know," Marcus murmured, voice heavy, "but I can't. Let 'em run me off. If I leave, they win. And I've already lost too much." Elijah studied him, his face etched with concern. "They want you broken, they want you bent. Don't give 'em that satisfaction." But Marcus, his voice dropped, grave. "Be ready, this fight's about to get uglier." Elijah was right. Within days, Dana arrived with news that chilled the air around the kitchen table. "They've filed again," she said, laying papers down between them. "Eminent domain. Claiming your gate threatens public access and safety. They've pulled strings with the county to push this through fast." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands pressing against the documents. "They're trying to steal it." Dana's eyes hardened. "This isn't just about a strip of land anymore. It's about power. But hear me, Marcus, we will fight, and we won't stop." The courtroom became a battlefield. The HOA brought in experts, consultants, even paraded a retired judge to strengthen their argument. But Dana countered with relentless precision, dismantling each claim, exposing their lies, reminding the court of the fence they had built to cage Marcus in. Piece by piece, she held the truth steady in the face of their storm. But outside those walls, another war raged. Local news stations seized the story, branding it the rancher versus the HOA. Commentators framed Marcus as either a stubborn troublemaker disrupting harmony or a hero standing against corruption. In the grocery store, strangers shook his hand, whispering thanks for his courage, while others spat insults, one woman hissing, "People like you never belonged here anyway." Marcus kept his head down, his jaw set, but the fire inside burned hotter than ever. Then one night, the conflict broke into violence. The crash of shattering glass yanked Marcus from sleep. He rushed to the living room, shotgun in hand. A brick lay among broken shards, and tied to it, a note scrawled in jagged ink. "This ends one way. Get out, or we'll make you." Marcus's hands trembled as he read. For the first time, death felt close, stalking him on the edges of the night. By morning, Elijah was back, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other ranchers stood with him, men Marcus barely knew, but who had heard his story. "You ain't fighting this alone anymore," one said, steady and firm. That small act of brotherhood lit something deep inside Marcus. Fear still lingered, but now so did resolve. His struggle was no longer his alone. Local churches began to speak out. Journalists reframed the story. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now stepped forward. Marcus had awakened something larger than himself. And still, Harold struck back. The HOA called an emergency meeting. The hall overflowed with residents, reporters, and cameras. At the front, Harold's voice shook with fury. "This man," he thundered, pointing at Marcus, "has divided us. He has turned neighbor against neighbor. And for what? His arrogance? His pride? If we allow him to keep that gate, we surrender the soul of our community." The room erupted. Cheers, boos, arguments. Spilling across the floor, Marcus rose slowly from the front row, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried clear and strong. "I didn't divide this community," he said. "You did, when you fenced me in, when you tried to silence me, when you tried to drive me out. All I ever wanted was to live in peace on the land I worked for. But you couldn't stand that, not because of a gate, not because of rules, but because of me, because of who I am." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some faces fell in shame, others hardened in defiance. Harold's face blazed crimson, his fist shaking with rage. "You call it arrogance," Marcus continued. "I call it dignity, and I won't give that up. Not to you, not to anyone." The hall erupted again. Cheers clashing against jeers. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. In the chaos, Harold's glare cut like a blade. That night, as Marcus stood once more by the gate, the heavy key cool in his palm, he whispered into the night, "You tried to break me. Now you'll see what happens when a man refuses to bend." The storm had reached its peak. The next move would decide everything, his land, his dignity, his very place in the world, and the HOA was preparing to strike harder than ever. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with paper. One last lawsuit, the HOA's final weapon. They called it a case of public necessity, a desperate attempt to seize Marcus's gate under the guise of law. Behind the polished facade of their legal team, Harold Whitaker stood tall on the courthouse steps, his suit pressed sharp, his words rehearsed. But his eyes carried the tremor of a man who knew the ground was slipping beneath him. Inside, the trial stretched. For weeks, testimonies clashed, lies layered over lies, truth struggling to cut through the fog. Each day felt heavier, as if the walls of the courtroom itself carried the weight of history. And in the center of it all stood Marcus, not just a rancher, defending his land, but a man transformed. Calm, steady, unyielding, he had become something larger, a living symbol of resistance. Crowds gathered outside each morning. They held signs high in the air. "Dignity can't be fenced in." Their voices carried down the courthouse steps, through the marble halls, and into the chambers where the fight played out. For every insult hurled against him, 10 voices rose in his defense. For every attempt to silence him, the cheers grew louder. And then, at last, the moment came. The gavel struck once. The judge's words rolled through the chamber like thunder breaking the silence. "The court finds in favor of Marcus Green. The HOA's claims are without merit. Furthermore, evidence of misconduct and harassment will be referred to the state attorney for investigation." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, tears, an explosion of relief and triumph. Harold's face drained of color as he collapsed into his chair, his empire unraveling before the world. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, voices overlapping, in a frenzy. And Marcus? He bowed his head, whispered a prayer, and carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had brought him this far. The fallout was swift and merciless. The HOA dissolved overnight, its leaders disgraced, some now facing charges. Harold Whitaker disappeared from the public eye, his name once a crown, now a curse. But Marcus's story was different. His victory was no longer just his own. He had not only defended his land, he had reclaimed the soul of a community. Weeks later, he stood at the gate once more. The key, worn and heavy, a relic of every battle fought, rested in his palm. Slowly, he slid it into the lock, turned turned it and swung the gate wide. Beyond it, children's laughter filled the fields. Neighbors walked the path freely, and for the first time in years, the land breathed again. Elijah stepped beside him, laying a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. Marcus's eyes stayed on the horizon. "No," he replied. "We did it. Every neighbor who spoke, every friend who stood guard, every prayer whispered in the dark. This was never just mine. It was bigger than me." He looked back at the open gate, the sun spilling gold across the land. "They built a fence to cage me, but fences fall, walls crumble. What endures is dignity. What endures is truth. And no one, no matter how powerful, can lock those away." The screen would linger on that image. Marcus standing tall at the open gate, his silhouette carved against the setting sun, a man unbroken, a symbol unbent. And as the scene faded to black, the words rang out one last time. "They put a fence around a black man's ranch, but he bought the land with the only gate key." In the end, it wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for dignity, for justice, for every soul who ever refused to bend.